Alright guys, how are you doing today? Hope you're doing well. In today's video I'm going to be talking about quite a few things actually. Society, culture, and employment. And I'm going to start the video by asking a very simple question. How are you? How are you? Seems a relatively simple question, doesn't it? Seems a very simple question to answer, right? But what do we really mean when we ask that question? And what's the intent behind it? And what kind of a response do people often want to hear when people ask that kind of question? And the reason I'm bringing this up at the start of the video here is because I think it's a good question. It's a good point to look at. It's a good thing to ask a series of questions about, probably. I think growing up in the UK, as I did in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s, the country had become, by that point, a much more liberal society than the decades before I was born. And I think because of that, we slowly began to see an erosion, let's say, of kind of eloquent, more perhaps classy forms of discourse with each other, I would say. I think that we've over time we've lost this kind of more respectful, civilized way of kind of communicating with each other directly. And that's kind of one of the major points I'm going to get on to later on in the video. And I'm going to outline a proposal that I think would be useful, specifically in the world of employment. But let's go back to that question for a second. How are you? Well, it's an interesting question because it often who asks you it, context in which someone asks you it, and the mood of that person who asked you it, and the tone, the inflection, or the kind of general mood, the atmosphere of that person, if you like, sort of sometimes dictates how you respond to it. You know, a typical answer might be something like, "I'm good," or "I'm fine," "Everything's good," "Everything's all right." But if you had to actually give a real answer to that question, would that work? Does it usually work? Is it usually tolerated? Is it usually seen to be something that's acceptable as a part of the kind of social norms, cultural norms, even? Because what does it actually mean? What does that question really mean? How are you? Well, it depends, doesn't it? I mean, it depends on a lot of things. Are they referring to my mood? Are they referring to things that because it can sometimes mean different things, right? It could mean what's your mood at the moment. It could mean what have you been up to? How have you been over the last few days or since the last time I saw you? If it's somebody you know or partially know, let's say, maybe it's just somebody you see in your local community or something like that. Or maybe it's somebody at work. But often who asks it sort of pressures you into answering in a very specific way. So, for example, if it's somebody in your family, you might sort of give a very brief answer with maybe a bit of humour in it, right? Typically, sort of British people tend to kind of keep things usually to a sort of relatively surface level response in regards to this particular question. Not always, but I'd say on average, it's usually a case of I'm good, I'm fine, everything's okay. Um, very kind of hollow, shallow, superficial way of kind of communicating, in my opinion. But I get the point of it. It saves time. It's supposed to be seen as being polite. It's a filler, if you like, sometimes. And yeah, I suppose it does serve a purpose in some ways. But but sometimes it does beg the question: if you're not really interested in the answer, then why ask it at all? Why bother asking such a question if you're not particularly interested in having any genuine answer whatsoever? Some people might say, well, it's better than not saying anything. Possibly. But you could also argue that it would be better, I think, and much more respectful and much more honest for people to ask questions that they actually, for the intent behind the question to be made clear, I would say. We're in a lot of society in the West, and in particular, certainly in the UK, where there's a real emphasis on politeness and manners, being courteous to one another. Certainly, in physical situations where people are next to each other or close to each other, right? Or when people talk to each other, usually on the phone or on video call, whatever, people generally try to be polite and respectful to one another. But behind closed doors, people often think very different things. People often say very different things about you and others. And again, I understand why that happens. But I think what that does is it breeds a kind of communicative culture, let's say, society, in which we all kind of normalize passive aggressiveness. We all kind of normalize essentially lying to each other and playing what I call, the kind of the game of social acceptedness. This game of meeting the kind of unspoken dynamics that others essentially expect from you when they ask things like "How are you?" There's this kind of unspoken dynamic that you're supposed to just know what to say and know when to cut it off, kind of a thing. There's this kind of pressure to conform to this idea that there is an accepted response, there is an accepted type of rhetoric, there is an accepted way in which you respond to certain types of questions, depending on the context and who asks the question. But like I said, what does it really mean, though? How are you? Are you talking about my mood, my mental health? Are you talking about my family? Are you talking about my life overall, my job, my relationship, the weather? What are you talking about? And the issue with those kind of types of questions is that you feel pressured to give a very swift response to them. But I don't know if you're anything like me, but I always kind of get irritated by those kind of questions because I personally, I would rather people didn't ask those types of questions, really, because it's too shallow. There's this expectation to play the game of small talk, and again, I get it. I'm not blind to why I get it to a point, but can we do better than that? Can we perhaps live in a way where we are more direct with each other, or we're more honest with each other, where we tell each other what we really think and feel? I would argue that is a much more that is a goal I think that we should aim towards as a society. And just to kind of divert for a second, it's sort of related, I suppose, in a way, but I just want to take this moment to say rest in peace to Anne Widdecombe and her family. And although it's not exactly related to the topic of this video, but it is kind of is, I suppose, that we live in a society where we think that we should be sheltered or isolated from other people's opinions that we don't like, right? Where we should live in a society away from truth somehow, that we should be sheltered from people's emotions and feelings all the time, and that we shouldn't ever have to confront anything difficult. That everything should be kept behind closed doors, as it were, and that anything that you deem to be offensive or you disagree with or you dislike should somehow be seen as something that should be kept away from you. And as Anne Widdecombe said, is that it is an occupational hazard in society that that at some point somebody is, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, is going to say something to you that is hurtful, that is perhaps seen as being offensive, or is something that you passionately disagree with. And I think that we tend to tolerate a society culture in the West where we feel that we all should be exempt from being offended, where we all feel that we don't have to be offended, where we don't have to engage with anything we dislike or we disagree with. And I think, bless her soul, and Widdecombe, although I admit that I didn't find her views on some things to align with exactly my values on certain areas of society, I respected her as an individual, and I respected the fact that she had the balls to be able to express herself honestly and openly. Okay, I accept that not everyone agree with her. As I just said, I didn't agree with everything myself. But I think it's important, very important, given what's happened, and also what happened not that long ago with Charlie Kirk as well, for people to be able to respectfully disagree with each other, to be able to be honest with each other. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of going off on a bit of a side, bit of a tangent here from what I've just been talking about, but it's sort of related, I think. We shelter ourselves from. We like to shelter ourselves from the realities of the world. We try to push away anything that we dislike or we disagree with or we find repulsive. Let's say we find doesn't match our standards. That crosses our perceived boundaries on certain things, right? And while you have a right to disagree and dislike things that especially politicians say, you have every right to do that. But what you don't have a right to do is to destroy someone's life, whether that's through harassment, whether that's through slander, whether that's through accusations, whether that's through assaulting somebody, whether that's through, in this case, unfortunately, murdering somebody. We must get back to a place in society. And actually, this does relate to what I'm going to come to a bit later on, maybe 20, 30 minutes from now, in regards to employment, I think. And I think you'll see the connection, sort of, if you can. It's not exactly, it's not quite linked directly, but it's sort of related to it, I suppose, in a way, that we must be able to be honest with each other. We must be able to listen to other people, even if we don't like them, even if we dislike them, not necessarily dislike them as people, but that we dislike something that they have to say and something that we feel passionately about and we don't share the same opinion on, right? And I think the reason that, going back to what I started this video off with how are you, we often answer in a way where we don't want to create any kind of confrontation. We don't want to have we don't want the conversation to dissolve into some kind of argument or some awkwardness. So we often refrain. We we deliberately navigate a lot of things. I personally think in ways that on the surface, on the surface may seem polite and respectful, and yes, that is true to a point. And temporarily, yes, it creates a sense of civility and peace. But I think in the long term, I don't think that's very healthy. I think that creates a kind of culture of silence. Really, it creates a kind of society of silence where everyone's just expected to just play this shallowness of small talk, this shallowness of we all answer in very we answer things in snippets. We hint at things, but we never really tell anybody the truth about anything. We never really open up about anything with most people. And I think in recent decades, that's become more prevalent in society, especially with regards to like communities, like people not talking to each other because they're different, in all sorts of ways. Even in the same communities, people are often divided because of something or other. Keeping up the Joneses kind of mentality, this sort of wall of silence because people don't want to feel like they're being intrusive. This sense that people don't quite trust each other anymore, and just a sort of gradual decline in the way in which people talk to each other and the way in which people treat each other more than anything else. And so I think that's a real shame. And I imagine that some of that is down to change in education standards, generational changes, just ways of the kind of the ways in which people used to speak have changed through generation to generation. Culture's change has become much more, I would argue, much more radically liberal, whereas perhaps in the past it was a bit more maybe structurally kind of conservative, I guess, be a bit more reserved, bit more. We had a bit more self-respect, I think, in society where we didn't. There was more. There was still a lot of repressed people, but we spoke to each other. But we spoke to each other, I think, with a lot more respect than we do today. But like I said, we were still probably a lot more repressed people in the past than there are today. But I do think that there is still a toxic prevalence of this attitude this kind of attitude that we all have to play the game of small talk. We all are expected to know the rules, all the social dynamics, all the nuances, all the awkward difficulties of various social settings, contexts, conversations, depending on who you're talking to, etc. All the time, that you're expected to just abide by it. You're not supposed to challenge it, criticize it, analyze it. You're just expected. That's just how it is. You hear that kind of thing a lot. Well, that's just how it is. No, that's how it is because we tolerate it. Because you tolerate it. I tolerate it. Right? We're all in this. We're all to blame for it. And I think we've got to move away from that. We've got to move away from that kind of attitude of, oh, well, that's just how it is. But it doesn't have to be. It doesn't need to be. It's just that we tolerate it because we would prefer temporary peace over vulnerability. We prefer a temporary, let's say, stability over transparency and honesty with each other. That's what I think it is. So again, my heart goes out to Anne Widdecombe's family and obviously members of Reform as well. To be fair, she was a part of Reform for the last couple of years of her life, and just yeah, whoever did this is clearly from what it appears to be some kind of politically motivated attack by all accounts. I think they've arrested a 28-year-old man now who's been brought in. I think they've got about a week to question him, I think, or they've got to release him. Apparently, this was a pretty brutal attack, and yeah, I don't know what exactly the motivation would be. I mean, obviously it's political, but what exactly, I don't know. Why this person ended up 300 miles away from his property, and I think it was in Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, I think it was in Devon, wasn't it? So I don't quite understand what that's really about. I don't know if it's somebody she knew or it was somebody that was just targeting her, or I don't know. I don't know, but we must. We are in a very dangerous situation. I think we're in a very dangerous era. I think where we're seeing this thing happen much on an almost regular basis, actually. And if it's not murders, it's attacking people. If it's not outright physical assaults, violence, it's a trial by media. You know, it's the media treating people unfairly, not giving them a real chance to defend themselves. You know, talking all over them, interrupting them during media interviews and like on Sky News, Good Morning Britain, all that kind of crap, right? The media are just as bad. They're just as much to blame because they've bought into this particular brand of in your face, intimidatory broadcasting now. Apparently, that's become the new in thing over the last 5-10 years, and so there's all that stuff going on, and not to mention all the bias as well. What seems to be an incredible amount of bias in mainstream broadcasters on all sides, obviously. All I would say that perhaps some are a bit better than others. I would say that GB News I think is a bit more balanced perhaps than certainly than Sky News and BBC. Although GB News obviously is a bit more right leaning than the likes of obviously Channel 4 or ITV or Sky News, the BBC. So I think we have to be honest about that. I'm sorry about the background noise here. We're in the middle of essentially the monsoon season here. But I hope you can hear me. Apologies if it's a bit loud. Just typical. I want to make a video, it just happens to start raining. But I do hope you can hear me very well. I'll try and reduce the background noise during the edit, so hopefully that comes out well. So we really do need to get away from this attitude of what I think and feel only matters in society. What I want only matters. We must move away. That is a very dangerous attitude to have, and it breeds all sorts of toxic justifications in a lot of people's heads. And I think we're starting to see a real rising left-wing radicalism, left-wing terrorism. What I don't know to put it. And that is getting very, very dangerous, I think, across the West. And the authorities are partly to blame for that, really, I think. Although obviously people's individual actions are the law. But I think the media aren't helping matters. And the police, which is another issue that we'll So some of you probably watched videos of people talk about the way the police have handled this case around Widdecombe the last few days now. It's just, quite frankly, being, I would argue, very unprofessional at best, and outright manipulative at worst. I would say that it's been handled very poorly, but also very maybe poorly, but also probably very deliberately. That they wanted to keep this almost kind of, they wanted to keep a lid on this for as long as they could. Not maybe partly because they didn't want to compromise the investigation. Okay, fair enough. But I also think a part of it was due to the police feeling a sense of pressure to keep it under tap because they're scared of what might happen if the public knows the truth. And that's why they've been lying, basically, right? Or at least being disingenuous, not telling the whole truth about what they knew. And this obsession with like releasing information about this scumbag, whoever the hell he is, who's killed this Pope, his identity, that is a British white national. I mean, it's funny how they can release that kind of information when it suits them, but in other situations, they want to keep a wrap on it, or they want to manipulate. And I just found it very interesting to me, that lack of consistency. Make of that what you will, but I don't know. I think there's something very fishy about that. So, getting back to my initial point of this video, I think intention matters. It's not what you say, it's how you say it, and it's what your intention behind it is that I think matters more than the words that you say. Because anybody can ask a question, a simple question. But I think the more important question is, what do you actually want to know? Why are you asking the question? What are you hoping to achieve by asking them? Is there some kind of specific information you want? Do you want a certain kind of answer? Do you want me to phrase it in a certain way? Do you want me to use a certain tone when I answer to you? Do you want me to guess what you want me to? I don't. Because I'm not psychic, and I think sometimes it's important that people just be honest, real, just say, look, how are you? How's things? Is everything all right? What's going on with you? I think because then it's like that seems a bit more warmer, friendly, approachable. Whereas just this kind of very cold, clinical, almost kind of sterile language of how are you, whatever that means, whatever that's supposed to mean. However the hell you're supposed to just assume that, you're supposed to just automatically assume that they want a specific kind of answer. Because at the end of the day, people usually ask you things for a reason. Maybe they've seen that you're in a bad mood. Maybe they've heard something about you. Maybe they saw something you posted online. Maybe I don't know, somebody was gossiping and you overheard them. Whatever it might be. There's always a reason why somebody asks you something. And I think it's important to know what that intention is. What is your agenda, if you have one? What is your intention behind asking me that question? Because if it is just small talk that you want, then I think you should make that clear early on. You shouldn't just assume, and quite frankly, you shouldn't just like expect me or almost kind of dictate to me that this is how the conversation is going to be, because you don't have that right. I think if you want me to answer it in a certain way, then you should say so. You should be honest about it. You should be direct about it, and not just resort to assuming that I know what you want, because I don't. Because what do you want me to say? Is this something you want from me? Do you just want me to participate small talk? Because how am I supposed to know it? I don't know what your intention is for asking. I don't know, right? So I think people need to be a bit more clearer when they communicate with you. They should ask for clarity, and they should be clear about what their intentions are when they communicate with other people, regardless of whether it's a stranger, a family member, a work colleague, right, your partner, parents, whoever, sibling, whoever it might be. Because it often then, because that then steers the conversation somewhere. You kind of know what kind of direction the conversation should go in, right? Because if I'm more than willing to engage in small talk, I'm more than happy to keep things surface level with you. I mean, I prefer not to, but I'm capable of that. I'm competent at doing that. But do I really want to? And I think really, when people say things like "How are you?" and they're expecting you to answer with "I'm fine" or something, some really sort of sharp, short response, what they're basically doing is they're asking you to engage in something, but not really. It's like they're expecting you to do something without you giving your consent. That's essentially what's happening. Because when you engage in some kind of small talk with somebody, you're expecting them to automatically comply and engage in something that you haven't given your consent to, really. That's how I would look at it. That's how I would argue. And if I know your intention, then that makes it easier on me, and it kind of makes me respect you a bit more, because you're not just assuming that I'm going to know what you want. If you're willing to tell me the truth, be honest with me, then I feel then I can actually answer you. I can give you an answer, a substantial answer. I can give you an answer that means something, substance. Because small talk isn't just, it's not just politeness and manners. It's tolerance. It's what we've kind of grown up to kind of expect, if you like, and people don't challenge that. And I think that everyone has a right to challenge it, and they should challenge it. They should talk about it. They should say, "What do you mean when you ask me that question? What do you mean by that answer? Why are you asking me that? Why now? What are your motives? What's happening here?" And I think people often oblige with small talk, not necessarily because they want to, but because they feel pressured into it. They feel pressured by, well, what if I don't give the answer that they want? What if I don't say the thing that they want to hear? And so people often will comply and conform to it. But it can create resentment. It can create awkwardness. It can create a sense like we're not really having a genuine conversation. We're engaging in a kind of unspoken series of expectations that neither of us want to truly address. Because actually we know what's going on. We already know what's happening here. And to address that, honestly, would be seen to be being confrontational or argumentative, being difficult. Really sorry about the brain sound. I wasn't expecting to brain so soon. Quite as heavy as this actually, but I do apologise. I will try my best to try and get rid of the background. Best as I can. I do apologise. But it's soothing sound, isn't it? See, a lot of people ask questions that sometimes they do actually want an answer, proper answer from you, but they they assume, they think that you know what their intentions are. They think that they expect you to know how they're feeling and what they're actually asking between the lines of it. And I'm sorry, but most people aren't psychics. That's just how it is, right? And sometimes people ask questions that they don't even necessarily really want a response. They just do it because, well, that's just what we do. We say hello, we say how are you, how's the work, whatever. We talk about some local thing going on in the community, or I don't know, prices of local transport's gone up, or I don't know, the council aren't doing something, or the weather's shit, or whatever it might be. So it's this thing of like, we don't really want to do this, but to not do it would be seen to be discourteous. Would be seen to be rude and ignorant, and impolite. And I think that is I don't know. I'm conflicted, I suppose, sometimes about this kind of thing. So I understand why it's needed to some extent. But I do think it breeds a society that tolerates passive aggressiveness, tolerates sort of ritual for the sake of it, really, a lot of the time, I think. It creates a sense that we would rather engage in shallowness than honesty, that we would rather engage in hollowness than vulnerability with each other. Probably because we don't really trust each other. And yeah, I just think it's that a lot of conversations can feel very empty and lacking in any real substance or meaning a lot of the time. I don't. And I think what that kind of creates is it creates a society of strangers. It creates a society of silence. It creates a society of people that don't really trust each other, don't really know each other very much, even next door neighbours, people in your own local community. You don't know anything about them. You never really talk to them apart from some shallow small talk once in a while. You never really get to know them. You never get to know them on a personal level. So you know people, but you don't know. And that applies to not only people in your local community, that applies to, well, a lot of people, really. Certainly, I would even say sometimes even family. You don't always know everything about your own family. You don't always know everything about your closest friends. You don't know everything about your partner, your wife, your husband, your children, your grandparents, your great. You don't know everything about them. And yet we see people. We spend so much time with people, and yet we don't. We talk to people, but we don't. We engage in conversations with each other, but it doesn't add anything to each other's life. It doesn't contribute. We acknowledge each other's presence, but that's often about as far as it goes. That's basically what small talk is: an acknowledgement of somebody else trying to be respectful in the presence of other people. But it feels, and it is, extremely. It's just a void, basically. And I think that's really sad. I think that's a real statement, if you like, about the state of society. What does that tell us about our culture, society, that we would prefer not to know each other. We would prefer to talk to each other but not know each other. And I get it. People's lives are complicated, messy. But what does it hurt to have 5 or 10 minutes with somebody over a cup of tea, or to invite somebody around for a meal? And that's why I think we've lost all that in the UK specifically. Certainly in England, we've lost a lot of that, where people used to be more trustworthy of their neighbours and people in their community. People used to know each other. Maybe not everything. I'm not saying that everyone's not every single nitty gritty detail of what everyone's lives. No, that would be inappropriate. Right? That wouldn't be. I don't think that would be right. But a lot of the time, we don't know anything about them. We know nothing. We know maybe if we're lucky, we might know their name or the name of their dog, or maybe we see them somewhere else. We know something about them, but we never actually sit down and talk to these people. And I think that's really sad. We know more about people online these days than we know about actual real people around us. And that to me is a fundamental flaw, and a real concern about the decline in civility, a decline in communication standards, a decline in compassion and empathy for one another. And I assume that that's because of an increase in individualism, an increase in liberal attitudes, probably. Ironically, weirdly. I just think we've seen over the past few decades a real decline in standards of education, manners, probably to some extent. Discourse with one another, a real sharp decline in standards of civilized debate, sensible, mature, civilized debate, discussing things that we have very different opinions on. The media has become a real problem, I think, in this regard, that has essentially pushed for a kind of broadcasting style of drama TV, really. It's almost like watching an episode of Jeremy Springer, or Jeremy Carl, or the Big Brother's House or something now, on some of these mainstream broadcasters, rather than it being professional, respectful, considerate journalism, which is not anymore, I think, for the most part. And again, that's a real shame, because that is breeding, I think, a generation of people who try to normalise it in their everyday lives, and I think that's a really damaging mentality to have. People often prefer to have very predictable, easy to follow, easy to engage with conversations about all sorts, until it comes to having to actually be real and vulnerable and truly honest about what they genuinely think and how they really genuinely feel about that thing. And I think a lot of people these days feel like they have to. We feel now that I think a lot of people feel that we live in a kind of very sort of police society now, where everybody's sort of watching what everybody else says, and we all have to censor ourselves. We all have to have these extra filters added on top of ourselves now than before. And that's really, again, that is a really poisonous way to live. Because I think a lot of us feel some degree of oppression, maybe, because of all this stuff. This excessive political correctness, this excessive need to be aware of everybody's sensitivities all the time, and constantly be checking what we think, what we feel, because it doesn't quite mean it doesn't, because we feel that we might offend somebody. And I think we need to get away from that kind of overly reserved, overly restrained makeup. And we need to start having some brave. We need to start having some. We need to start having some balls. We need to start opening up and saying, I'm not gonna resort to childish playground tactics. I'm not just going to insult you. I'm not going to accuse you of things that I have no evidence of. I'm not going to turn this into some ego bashing thing or mental gymnastics dynamic. But what I am going to do is I'm going to be real and direct with you and respectful, yes, but I'm going to tell you the truth. And I think that's what we need in society. We need people to speak up. We need to get away from this culture of self-censorship. That doesn't mean that you have to be a jerk. It doesn't mean that you have the right to be a dick towards one. It doesn't give you the right to be an asshole. I'm not suggesting that at all. But what I am saying is that we should have some courage to say, I don't intend to offend you. I don't intend to upset you. But I think it's important that we are able to, as adults, talk to each other like adults, like civilized, mature, sophisticated people, without this turning into a tit for tat, slagging off match, shit throwing competition, right? Which is a lot of, I think now, have a lot of disagreements end up dissolving into. And that's a terrible shame, because it didn't used to be like that. People used to be able to have civilized, and sure, people still do, but I think there was a real prevalence of lowered standards in society. I think we have to have the courage to be able to be vulnerable with one. That doesn't mean we all have to share everything about each other. That doesn't mean we all have to like each other. That doesn't mean that we all have to agree with each other. But we need to be somewhat comfortable with differences. We need to be able to accept that not everybody thinks like us. Not everybody feels like us. Not everyone reads into things the same way as we do. Not everyone interprets things the same way we do. And that's okay. That's fine. That's the society we should have, right? We should have a difference of opinion, a whole spectrum of views, right? That's good. That's healthy, right? That's how society should be. What we shouldn't have is one group saying that other group's the enemy, or vice versa, and essentially creating a line down the middle and saying, you're either with us or you're against them. You're either with them or you're with them. That's it. You can't be with both. Well, why not? Why not? Surely people are allowed to have views on all sides of things, aren't they? Like there's a thing called nuance. There's a thing called a breadth of different feelings and thoughts on different topics, right? I mean, I'm sure you could pick literally any topic and you could have all sorts of views on it, right? But when it comes to things like specifically politics, there's this kind of mentality in the UK, I think, this tribalistic mentality. You can't have competing views. You can't have conflicted opinions and feelings about certain issues. You're not allowed to have left and right views. You're supposed to only have one or the other. Why? You're not supposed to support more than one party. Why? Why not? What if I have values that the Labour Party represents, but I don't like everything the Labour Party represents? Or certain views that the Conservatives represent, but I don't like everything they represent? Or Reform, or Restore Britain, or the Liberal Democrats, or maybe even the Greens, or UKIP, or whoever else, right? What's wrong in that? Why aren't you allowed to have a breadth of opinion on different things, different values, different beliefs? Dare I say, different biases, right? you're conflicted about different sides. You know, there are things on all sides, I think, that have some relevance to the benefits of society, right? So, and I don't like this black or white thinking. I don't like this attitude of divide and conquer, whether it's in the media, whether it's in politics, in culture, even in music, perhaps even. No, you can't be that thing because you're this. You can't like that music because you're into that music. Why not? Why? Says who? You can't like that person because you're this person. You like this fashion, so you can't like that fashion. You can't like that particular style of painting or music because you're not the right class for it. Who says who? Who gets to decide this fucking bullshit? Excuse my friend. But I mean, who dictates all this kind of thing? You know? I think we just need to say, look, this is who I am. I don't expect everyone to like me, to agree with everything I have to say. And I accept that some people will be critical of things that I say on certain topics, including, like, obviously in this video, like all the other videos I've put, right? That is just a hazard that you have to accept. Excuse me. That is just an occupational hazard of being an adult, right? Whether it's online or offline, you have to accept that people are at some point going to disagree with you. Some people are going to insult you. That says more about them than it does me. Some people are just going to dislike you for who you are. All right, fine. You can't expect everyone to like you. You can't expect everyone to agree with you all the time. That is unrealistic. It is naive, and it's foolish, and it's a very, very dangerous attitude. And I suggest that people put that kind of stuff down and develop a more balanced way of thinking and approaching people with a bit more respect. Just because you disagree with someone, you dislike them, doesn't give you a right to treat them poorly, right? You do not have that right. We must be brave to say the things that we feel need to be said. And I think the reason people don't is partly because there's a lot of cowardice in society. There's a lot of people that prefer short-term comfort over long-term transparency, long-term realness, realism. Because that's what we are. We're creatures of comfort. And quite frankly, that really fucking pisses me off. It really does. We are lazy. We are cowards. We are ignorant. We are naive. We are selfish. We are stupid. We are moronic at times. And it really frustrates. Really does frustrate me. Because we can be better than this. We can do better. Let's try to be better. Myself included. I'm not perfect either. Okay, I make mistakes all the time. The key is to try and learn from it. Is to analyze yourself. Look at yourself. What can you do better? How can you be better as a human being? Right? That's what improves society. I can't do it all. I can't do it. I'm just one lay person. I'm nobody special with my 2,000 plus subscribers. I'm nobody, right? I accept that. I'm a nobody. But at the same time, I accept that if we all try to improve our attitude and mentality toward them, we would live in a better society. We really would. The question is, why don't people want to do that? And I suspect it's answered in one word, and that is comfort. And that's very sad. And it's a shame because that prevents so much progress in society. Such stubbornness prevents progress. So I'm going to get onto the point in a second that I mentioned earlier with regards to employment. And before I mention that, though, I think it's important to look at this whole, very briefly, this culture in Britain of politeness. I think we often dress it up as politeness, manners, right? And decency. But I would argue that it's more about tolerance. It's more about a stubborn, tolerant attitude of not rocking the boat, not wanting to break this kind of unspoken code, right? We dress it up as politeness, we dress it up as tolerance, right? But in reality, what it really is a society of people that have messy relationships with themselves and others. And because of that, they don't want to get involved in other people's lives. That's how I see it. It's a way of trying to make it look on the surface that we live in a very civilized, very sophisticated society. Sure, on the surface it looks like that. But when you strip that away, what you realise is that those things are coping mechanisms. Those things are essentially structures that are in place, if you like. So social, cultural structures, historical norms that have been passed on to generations that essentially hide away the real reality. It's like being on a stage, right? You see all the glamour, all the glitz, and then they peel back the curtains and it's just a bunch of props, and it's just a bunch of clothing on hanger rails, and lighting and sound system, or whatever else. It's just like things thrown on the floor. That's life, basically, right? We all like to see the entertainment level, if you like, the facade. We all like to see the facade. We like the thrill of the facade, right? We tolerate. We like the ignorance of it all, right? We like to pretend that we don't know. We don't want to know. That is a major, major problem. Because that leads to all sorts of problems. That's going to lead into, in a second, very well to what I'm going to talk about. So is politeness bad? No, not bad. But is it always healthy? Is the better question. And I would argue, no, I don't think it is. I think politeness often covers up things. It dresses up things. It suppresses things, I think. And I think we must be able to be honest about that. It can come across as respectful, as kind, but actually, I think more than anything else, to me, politeness is just another word for avoidance. I think British society is full of passive aggressiveness. I think it's passive aggressive in its humour. It's often passive aggressive in the way that we talk to each other, as I've sort of laid out, I think, throughout this video so far. I think it's in the things that we do, the things that we celebrate, and in our politics, especially, and our media as well. I think that there is an argument to be made about whether politeness is actually, whether politeness is something we should tolerate. And what I mean by that is, I don't mean that we should all turn around and start swearing at each other and being impolite and being obnoxious and insulting and punching down, right? No, that's not what I mean. What I mean is, I think that we should be willing to be a lot more straight, right? Not just polite just for the sake of it, because we think it's easy, right? We should be able to be. I think surely we can do both, can't we? Can't we be direct but and polite? Can't we be direct and honest? Right? Surely we can do that. You know that the problem with British society, much like society over here in Thailand, is an avoidance of conflict. It's an avoidance. It's an avoidance of having to deal with the uncomfortable realities of other people. It's a deliberate avoidance of having to look at yourself in the mirror and ask some very difficult questions about who you are, what your biases are, what your perhaps fragile values might be, your fragile perception of yourself, your fragile ego is and why it is, about your fragile coping mechanisms that I've had in years of pain and suffering and frustrations like everybody else. I think we need to sit down and say, this is who I am. This is what I am. This is what I represent. This is me. I don't want to have an argument with anybody necessarily, as long as, well, I don't mind having an argument as long as it's civilized. But I don't want to live in a society where we simply just tolerate people for the sake of it. I don't really want to live in a world like that. I want to live in a world where we can be a bit more real and open with one another. Because I think most of our lives we spend avoiding conflict, avoiding problems, avoiding the things that we need to confront. And so we delay things, we let things fester, we let things ferment, we let things get back because we would rather somebody else dealt with it. That's somebody else's problem. I don't want to get into that. It's too complicated, it's too messy, it's too real, it's too human. And so we pretend to be a lot more dignified, perhaps, than we really truly are. And a lot of people think that you don't realize that you don't see that. Well, I personally do, and I'm sure millions of other people. Yeah, I do see it. I do realize. I do recognize what's happening, and like I'm doing here, I call it out, and I will say things as I see fit to say them, not because I'm just trying to be some kind of edgy, sort of rebellious individual or anything, but because I think somebody has to say something. Somebody has to have the ability and the opportunity to say the things that other people don't want to say. Because somebody has to be the first person, right? Somebody has to be able to stick their head up and say, actually, I don't consent to it. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's the right approach. I don't think that's the right thing to do. This is actually really what's going on, rather than how you're presenting it to be, how you're trying to stroke your own ego and protect yourself, which is why you want to create a certain image for the public with regards to media and politics and things like that. This is why a business is trying to do this, because it's trying to save its own neck, rather than how you're portraying it, etc., right? People often try to protect their image over everything else. It's always a protection of one's. People go into self-preservation mode a lot of the time. I think quite frankly, I think a lot of people live in that. This mode of me, 24 hours a day. Not necessarily in some terrible, horrible way, but just in the sense that, and what annoys me is that people just accept it. People just accept things. That's what annoys me. It's not so much what people do, it's the fact that people tolerate it, even though they know what's going on. They know the reality. They know the truth. They know the ugly, messy facts, right? And they don't say anything. They don't do anything. because no, I don't want to get involved. It's not my business. It's somebody else. It's not my place to say that. This kind of like way of thinking is really damaging. That's why so many friendships end up in arguments, conflicts. Same with relationships and marriages, and issues at work. Lead to arguments eventually, and revolving door cultures. I'm going to get onto that in a second. There are so many things that could be probably quite easily avoided if we were just able to just accept a bit of discomfort temporarily. I think. Because I think if we spend our lives avoiding discomfort, we actually end up creating more of it for ourselves. Far more than that bit of discomfort we might have had to face temporarily, right? And that leads to resentment, that leads to bitterness, it leads to a passive aggressive way of sort of eventually a kind of accepted passive aggressive discourse. Dare I call it even discourse? But it creates an environment of frustration, of distrust, dishonesty, and so on. Right? I think I believe it's better to confront issues rather than let them boil and simmer to the point where those problems start off like that and then become like this, right? It's. I mean, that's just to me. That's just common sense, surely, right? But people often don't work on that basis. People work on the basis of how they feel, not what's rational, not what's logical. People are, well, this is how I feel, so therefore, well, that must be true then. That's like, well, I feel this, so therefore that's automatically. I'm offended, so therefore that must mean it's automatically offensive. I'm offended by something, so therefore that means it's wrong. No, no, that's just how you feel about something. That doesn't make it a fact. Just as when I feel something, it doesn't make it a fact. Because what I'm saying in this video doesn't necessarily make it a fact. Just my opinion, just my perspective, right? Just as yours are yours and everybody else's. You are allowed to have your opinions, your perspective. You're allowed to have your feelings, but that doesn't always necessarily mean that they're true, especially when it comes to things as fragile as emotions, feelings. And this is partly why people gossip so much, right? This is part of why people talk about each other behind each other's backs, why so much backstabbing, gossiping, and lying in society, right? Because people don't seem to have the ability to tell the truth in a very mature and in a mature and careful way. I think we're able to. I think we should be able to have honest conversations, but in a very kind of measured and restrained and respectable, more than anything else, manner. Right? If we can do that, then we can avoid some of these other problems in society. But people seem to prefer doing the more negative stuff, like I've just mentioned. So people will let problems get bigger. They'll let problems get more complicated and messier because nobody wants to confront them. They keep kicking that can down the road about this issue, about that issue, about this political point, about this social pressure, about that cultural norm. Something's become a cultural norm, right? Whatever it might be. Something going on in the family, some issue with someone's kid at school, some relationship issue, right? Some problem at work, some issue with one's boss that's becoming too obsessed with micromanaging. I don't know, whatever it might be. It doesn't lead to anything positive. I don't think most of the time. It doesn't lead to anything productive, and it doesn't create a healthy environment for people to live in, to exist in. If you want to be in a more healthy environment, not just for yourself, but for other people as well, I think it's a healthy environment. The way to create a more healthy society and environment for you and other people is to have some truth, is to have some heart to heart from time to time. You know, doesn't necessarily mean that we all have to be telling each other every little bit of our personal private lives. But I think it does. It's important that we share with one another truth from time to time, not just half truths or bits of truths. Just to tell the truth and to not be so scared about being judged and criticised for it, which is often why people refrain from doing so. Because when people say nothing, it creates an environment of silence. And if you're not careful, that then creates an atmosphere of pressure to conform to that silence. And that is just as bad as the silence. Because what that often means is that someone who finally speaks out is deemed to be the problem rather than what the actual problem is that person is coming out and being critical of or coming out about. So that solves nothing. How does that help anybody, right? So I think in the end, we need to be more direct with each other. And to get onto the point of employment now, which just took me apparently over an hour to do so. Apologies for that. But I think what we need to establish in the world of employment, in my opinion, and maybe something like this probably does exist to a certain extent, but I don't think my proposal fully exists in reality as far as I know. I could be wrong, but I don't think it does. I think something that would be extremely useful in most employment environments would be to have a grievances mechanism where, and what I mean by, I don't mean just you just going to HR, you going to your boss and complaining, or go writing via email or whatever it is. Right? I mean an actual meeting every week, let's say on a Friday afternoon, last port of call of the day, right? Where all staff, management, HR, whoever, or certain representatives of let's say HR or management, whoever, if it depends on if it's a big company, whatever, where the employees all have an opportunity, let's say in certain departments, let's say, they have a 30-minute, 40-minute slot, let's say, or something, whatever it might be, where they all have an ability to express, to get things off their chest, to have an ability to have a respectful, calm, honest, professional, dignified meeting where everybody has an opportunity to express their concerns about work, whatever's going on in their particular career, their environment, wherever it is the work, whether it's a hospital, an office, a school, I don't know, whatever it might be. Whatever it is, where all those employees and others have the ability to have some mechanism to be able to express their concerns, their troubles, their annoyances in a way that's constructive and productive. Not just simply just sitting there, everyone just slagging each other off, right? Obviously that wouldn't work. But in a way where everyone is, careful about how they say things, but they're direct about it. They say, I found so-and-so's handling of something a little bit inappropriate. I thought they could have maybe done something better. So what I would do is I would have it in a way where everyone tries to phrase their grievances, let's say, in a kind of more positive light, let's say. Not just, I hate this person, I dislike that person. I don't really think that helps. I think the best thing to do is to allow people to express their concerns in a yes, a direct way, but in a way that allows people to get off the chest. I didn't find the management's I didn't particularly think, I don't find the management's new proposal for this to be very productive or useful. I found that Claire's response to that phone call on Wednesday to be a little bit mismanaged, or I don't know, whatever it might be, whatever the concerns are, whatever the complaints are. I think that would be really constructive and useful for those people, because not only does it potentially avoid people leaving after a few weeks and months, in which in which case it would create a revolving door culture. But what it means is that those people go home on a Friday afternoon, let's say, just for example. Let's say they have a grievances expression hour, something like that, whatever you would call it, an accountability hour, right? Whereby every individual would be able to get to express their problem, whatever it is they've got a problem with, and that'll be the end of it. Basically, everyone gets a chance, everyone gets to have a say, right? And then at the end of that day, that's it. It's over. Whatever the problems of that week are, it would be a weekly thing. Excuse me. And at the end of that day, everyone would go home, right? If it's a Friday or maybe it's a Saturday, one of those, right? Where everyone goes home and sort of feels a bit better, right? Because they've got it off the chest, rather than everyone clinging on to this seething resentment of colleagues, co-workers, right? Which I don't think helps anybody. Doesn't help the company, doesn't help the staff, doesn't help management or HR, right? I think it's important that people can go home at the end of the week not worrying about all that stuff, not feeling that pressure to have to constantly keep their mouth shut all the time. This work and this employment environment of put up and shut up kind of a thing. That's just something you're meant to tolerate. And sure, even though you would still have to tolerate it to a certain extent, at least every week you'd have an ability to call it out. Rather than just tolerating it, you can actually mention it. You can talk about it in a respectful, civilized way. And I think that would really make the environment more professional. It would create more trust and respect, and it might actually minimize some behaviours that are unacceptable or questionable, right, or even immoral. And I think you'd find that people would probably stay in their jobs a lot longer. Because I think the reason people often quit their jobs is because they just don't feel like they're being listened to. They feel unheard. They feel like their concerns don't matter. And given that people are giving their finite time, right, and energy to something that they spent 8 to 12 hours a day on, 5 or 6 days a week, I think it's only right that they have an ability to get that stuff off their chest, but in a way that's more direct than just going to your manager and talking about it in private. I don't really think that resolves anything. I think everyone's got to get off the chest what they think and feel about each other for an hour. Everyone gets a chance to say something about each other, right? Or whatever it is that they've noticed during the week, their observation. They get maybe a 10-15 minute slot each, right? And then everyone else gets a shot as well. Right? Everyone gets a chance to have a go. And I think what you'd see is probably see a reduction in people taking time off. You'd see a reduction in bullying, workplace passive aggressiveness. You'd probably see a bit more respectfulness towards one another. I think it wouldn't. I'm not saying, of course, I'm not suggesting that you would create any kind of utopia working. You still have to. There will still be people that don't like you and things you don't like about others, etc. But at least at the end of that week, at the end of the week, regardless of whatever shitty stuff's going on Tuesday, Thursday, whatever day it is, at the end of that week that there was a guaranteed slot for you to be able to express the things that you want to get off your chest. Whether it's a daily thing, whether it's once a week, whether it's twice a week, I don't know. Something like that, some kind of a mechanism like that, I think would be probably quite revolutionary for a lot of workplaces. And I think that is desperately overdue. Sure, there would have to be some kind of rules or boundaries, perhaps. I don't think it would be. I don't think it would be appropriate for everyone to just sit there insulting each other or to start using inappropriate language. Sure, there would need to be a degree of professionalism, but at least everybody would feel like they're on a kind of a level playing field, as it were. That people would think, okay, you don't like me, I don't like you, but at least we can get it off our chest rather than just us pretending. At least we kind of know that we don't like each other. But now that we know what's going on here, at least we can either avoid each other if necessary, or we can get it off our chest. Just get it off our chest, right? I think that would work. I really do. And I think you need to set more boundaries in the workplace. You need to have more rules. You need to have more rules about professional conduct. And not just in the world of employment, the average employment, but certainly in the media, in the way journalists conduct themselves, right? They need to have I think Ofcom needs to have a much higher standard of professional conduct, in my opinion. Certainly these mainstream broadcasters, because it's fucking appalling some of the ways that they treat some of their guests. Can't get a word in edgeways. It's basically just an assault on their character, a witch hunt the moment they start talking, etc. That to me is unacceptable. I really think that needs to be dealt with through kind of some new legislation about professional conduct. I think in which in some cases there should be kind of a free strike bringing you out. You get 3 cautions and that's it, you're out. And that would be like you breaking rules to constantly interrupting guests, slandering them, defamation, all that kind of stuff. It should be, to me, there needs to be much more stricter regulations by Ofcom on these mainstream broadcasts. Probably newspapers as well, actually, while we're at it. Because I think they get away with too much. It might be an unacceptable thing. That's disgusting. So we need much more boundary setting in the workplace. Rather than just accepting things, we need to say, this is my boundary, this is the boundary of the workplace. You're gonna respect these boundaries as my colleague, as my employee, whatever it is, whatever the relationship is, and you're gonna abide by it because it's healthy for everybody. It's not just about me or you. This is the best respectful thing to do for everybody. Let's have some boundaries. Let's have some respectful, civilized boundaries in which we all accept, we all respect, we all understand why they're necessary, and we all try to follow them as best as we can. Let's try and have a bit more dignity and classy demeanour amongst each other. I think that's important. And the reason I'm saying all of this stuff regarding employment here is because what happens when we don't allow people to have their grievances, air their grievances? What happens? We have a toxic culture of passive aggressiveness. Bad behaviour kind of becomes normalised, accepted, right? Because nobody wants to call it out. And nothing gets done about it anyway, so nobody bothers calling it out. So unless we set boundaries, unless we say it's okay to challenge this, it's okay to call it out, then nothing changes. And you just end up with a toxic work culture. And we know it's prevalent globally, right? And we know it's very prevalent in many Western forms of employment. I don't want to work in an environment, and having worked in environments that are quite toxic as well, where essentially there's normalised toxic behaviour, whether it's people being disrespectful to one another, people bullying as banter, right? Managers treating their employees poorly, right? People not getting their money on time and not getting the right amount of money. Colleagues bickering, arguing about things. Just a lack of professionalism, a lack of maturity, a lack of professional standards that leads to a toxic, very toxic environment, which people essentially despise getting up in the morning and going to work, right? That's not the kind of thing I want. If you expect me to work 8 to 12 hours a day, let's say, right, 14 hours, maybe more, right, per day, for 5 or 6 days a week, then the last thing I want to do is get up at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning and have to not only deal with all of the complex nature of my job, or whatever the job is, right? Because that's complicated in and of itself. But I've also now got to deal with all the other stuff that's a part of it that I didn't ask for, that I did not sign, that I did not consent to, that I did not sign my name to when I started this job. But I'm just expected to just tolerate, right? I want to go to work, tolerate something to a certain degree, do my job to the best of my ability that I can, go home, right? And hopefully go home with as relatively clear head as I can, with as little stress and as little pressure in my head as I can. Because I've got shit going on in my private life, right? The last thing I want is to take all the shit. People say things like, oh, you shouldn't take your private things to work. Well, how many people take crap from their jobs home? People don't talk about that a lot. How many people talk about the stress and pressures and bullshit that people have to deal with at work that seeps into their private personal lives? A lot. A lot is the answer. And unfortunately, we live in a society that we're expected to just to tolerate it. You're getting money for it, aren't you? You get 2 holidays per year. So what's the problem? The problem is that people don't go to work to be an actor, to put on masks all day long. People go to work to do a job that they try to do to the best of their ability, most of the time, hopefully, to get paid a certain amount of money, to pay the bills, maybe afford a car, maybe afford a house, maybe afford few small holidays per year, maybe have Christmas and New Year off, and that's about it. The last thing people want to be doing is going to work and having to be some kind of a psychologist, psychiatrist, therapist, right? Whatever. It's not. Most people don't want to go to work to have to tolerate a toxic culture of excessive annoyances and obnoxious behaviours day in, day out. Because all that does is that just tells people that this is not the right job or career for me, and I'm going to leave, and I'm going to go somewhere else. So if you want to retain staff, your job as a company, as the management, as the HR, is to make people's lives easier, not more difficult. It's as simple as that. If you don't want your staff to be resentful and to hate every second of their time in their job, then make it easier. Give them some release, because otherwise you create a pressure cooker environment for them to exist in, and eventually somebody in that environment will snap. And that's why my proposal of a grievances process, where everybody gets together and expresses their problems, is so necessary. So why Friday? I'm going to come to the end of this video in a moment. But why Friday? Well, it's on average usually what Friday is usually in the UK, typically anyway, usually for most people, the end of the work week, right? So if you have a chance to air your grievances, you have Saturday and Sunday off, right? You don't have to worry about it. You've got it all off your chest. You can go into your weekend not having to think, worry. You've got it all off your chest. You can go into the weekend, as it were, with a clean slate, right? And you can come back to work on Monday with a clean slate, without all the unspoken resentments and things going on, right? You're not carrying it all with you all weekend, which again is seeping into your personal private life that should have nothing to do with the problem of work, right? They should have nothing to do with each other. They should be separate, right? I accept your personal private life shouldn't seep into, shouldn't leak into your work life, but equally your working life, I don't think should leak into your private life. That's my opinion. In reality, they often do in some way, but if you can minimise that, then obviously you should do that. So, what I would suggest is, as far as rules, I would say that there shouldn't be any personal insults, shouldn't be any real sort of bad language if you can avoid it. Try to avoid shouting or talking over each other. No humiliating or embarrassing kind of a sort of rhetoric, if you like, or sort of phrasing of things. And you should be professional, courteous, respectful, constructive, but yeah, direct, be honest. But be honest in a more measured, constructive, healthy way, right? That's all I would say. Let's try to get away from this, what's become in many areas of society in recent decades, this culture of attacking people's characters, attacking people's personalities, rather than the things that they do and say. Because they're not always the same thing, right? So instead of just focusing on the person and attacking their character, let's attack the behavior. Let's focus on the behavior. Let's call it out. Let's call things out when it's necessary, when you feel it's necessary to do so. Because that way you improve communication standards and you create a more respectful environment for people to exist in. So instead of just insulting people, you say what you have to say. You say something direct, okay, fine. But you say it in a way that not only is it helpful, but it doesn't just smear someone's status or reputation or image in that environment, because that's not going to help you. Right? That isn't going to help you, because people will get defensive and they will attack you. So I don't recommend that is how people should deal with this grievances or accountability hour, if you like, whatever you want to call it, meeting of some sort. Everybody's involved. Nobody interrupts each other as best as you can. Everyone gives constructive, positive feedback, if you like, as best as you can. And like I said, it includes everybody. And the management shouldn't just be aimed at from employee to employee. It should be employee to manager, or employee to HR, or vice versa, right? And outline issues of micromanagement, perhaps set policies that aren't working, or you don't feel that they're benefiting people in some way. Issues of poor communication, incompetence, unrealistic expectations, inconsistency, a lack of transparency, a lack of respectful behaviour, and so on, right? Or issues with leadership even. And if that can't be achieved, then maybe it should be done through some kind of anonymous process where all the complaints, every week, everybody gets to write some kind of complaints or grievances form or something. And the manager or whoever's in charge of it picks out the most important things from those complaints, right? And or maybe talks through all, and doesn't necessarily obviously it's anonymous, and nobody's names will be on the pieces of paper, but essentially those problems, whoever they've been written from or whoever they're about, they get addressed, and they get addressed properly. And the group, instead of just everyone just being at each other, the group tries to come to solutions, and that's what my initial proposal would be anyway. That everybody comes together and says, how can we improve this? What can we do instead of everybody just simply complaining about it? What can we improve? What can we do better? We're all humans. We're all here for the same reason, give or take, right? Nobody really truly wants to be here, but we all need money. We're all got things to pay for. We've all got debts and bills and amenities, etc. Right? Fair enough. So let's try and understand each other a bit more. Let's try and have a bit more empathy and compassion for each other. You don't have to necessarily get along all the time or like each other all the time. That's fine. That's to be expected. But let's try to improve things for everybody, right? Let's make this a bit better for everybody. Let's have a bit more accountability and responsibility. And let's try to find ways of reducing burnout, reducing criticism of each other in working hours. Let's try and reduce passive aggressiveness, grudges, resentments, issues with trust, inconsistencies, power imbalances, etc. Because I think if you do that, people feel more heard, they feel more respected, and they're not likely to go off and start looking for another job or leaving, which causes obviously problems for recruitment and the company itself. And I think over time it improves people's mental health, it reduces risks of burnout, and it reduces the risks of people carrying a lot of emotional, psychological baggage in work and out of it. And it just creates a more accountable environment. It reduces the Monday blues, if you like, and it reduces risks of conflicts, arguments, sort of cliques forming, I guess, in some way you could say. People perhaps trying a bit harder with each other, even if they don't necessarily always like everything about each other, or I think the problem is, I think so many people are so quick to dismiss people before they've given them a chance. We're very judgmental as human beings. We're very critical, very dismissive, very quick to shut people down, to make assumptions about each other. And I think we need to do better than that. We can, I believe, when capable of so much positive stuff, so much progress in the ways that we think and feel about each other. But we have to do some soul searching, I think. And I think another part of this also, just to add here before I draw this to an closure here, is the interview process of employment, I think, needs to dramatically change as well. I think we need to get away from this culture of creating the employer creating a kind of glorified golden image of the job, the career, whatever it is, right? And let's have some transparency about what it exactly is that you want me to be, or you want this potential employee to be in this job. I think it's on you. The burden is on the employer to be honest about what that job really truly entails, not just what you're trying to entice me into it. And to tell me what to expect, what's genuinely honest is what to expect. Because then there's no hidden surprises when I get into that job and I get frustrated and fed up after a couple of weeks or months, to the point where I walk out that door. So let's have a bit more openness and honesty, shall we, with recruitment and interviews, and not just the usual generic questions. And let's have some honesty from the interviewees as well, right? Let's answer questions in interviews honestly and openly. Tell the truth. Be honest about what it is you like, why you're really applying for the job. Don't be so fearful and scared all the time. Don't be so reserved and just willing to give the interviewer the kind of responses you think they want to hear. I think it's important for both sides to have some real honesty about what it is that they expect of you, and what it is that exactly you're going to get. Because otherwise you end up with pressures, expectations, clashes of personality, and challenges that people are unprepared for. I mean, those things are going to happen anyway, but at least you can give somebody a bit of a heads up about what to expect, right? And I think that's the right thing to do. I really do. Work is stressful as it is, with meeting quotas, I don't know, deadlines, pressures, awkward colleagues, customers, management, whatever, right? The endless amounts of expectation from HR. So I think it's better to have some transparency from all sides. And conflict isn't always bad. In interviews, in the workplace, in real life, conflict isn't always negative. I would argue that a lot of the time conflict is actually healthy, but it's the way in which you approach it that matters. So that's it, basically, for this video. I haven't really got anything else to say on this topic. I think I've covered pretty much everything I wanted to say. Again, it's been another long video, as always. Sorry about the noise again for the third time, but yeah. So anyway, look, I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you could even hear me, I hope hopefully you can by the time I've edited this. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, And I'll catch you on the next one. Thank you. Bye bye.